Jean Stein was an heiress and a gifted author who explored the hidden lives of the elite in works like Edie. But after a lifetime of observing the tragedy of others, she wrote her own brutal ending. At 83, inside her exclusive penthouse, Jean walked to the terrace and climbed over the railing. There was no note, just a terrifying 15-story plunge to the cold Manhattan pavement below. The woman who knew everyone had finally become the tragic subject of her own life story. But to fathom the depth of that final choice, we cannot look only at 2017, because the height Jean Stein fell from wasn't built of brick and mortar. It was constructed of power, control, and cold ambition by the man who engineered her fate before she was even born. The dark shadow cast on the pavement that day actually began decades earlier, in a world of blinding technicolor. It began with the doctor, Jean Stein, a name that commanded both awe and fear in Hollywood. Born in Indiana to a modest Jewish family, Jules didn't start his professional life as a mogul, but as an ophthalmologist. He understood the mechanics of the eye. He knew about lenses, about focus, about how human beings perceive the world. But Jules Stein quickly realized a ruthless truth. Curing blindness was a retail business, while manipulating public perception was wholesale. In the roaring 1920s, he traded his scalpel for a saxophone, and then traded the saxophone for a ledger. He founded the Music Corporation of America, MCA. It began as a booking agency for bands in Chicago speakeasies, but under Jules's cold, brilliant stewardship, it metastasized. By the time Jean was born in 1934, MCA was no longer just an agency. It was the octopus. Its tentacles were everywhere. Jules didn't just represent talent. He owned the infrastructure of stardom itself. He was the most powerful man in Hollywood, yet he moved like a ghost. He avoided the press. He didn't want fame. He wanted control. He was a man who believed that everything and everyone had a price, a function, and a place. And tragically, that rule applied to his own children. She grew up in Misty Mountain, a hilltop estate in Beverly Hills that was designed to intimidate. It was a house that looked like it had been airlifted from the English countryside and dropped onto the California scrub. There were manicured gardens, servants in livery, and a view that allowed Jules Stein to look down, literally, on the studios he controlled. The director of this domestic drama was her mother, Doris. Doris didn't just want a good life, she wanted a royal life. She modeled herself on the British aristocracy, scrubbing away the new money scent of MCA with layer upon layer of imported antiques and snobbery. For Doris, children were accessories. They were to be seen and admired like the porcelain vases in the hallway, but never heard, and certainly never messy. "Jean?" her mother would say, looking at her daughter with a critical, appraising eye. "Don't slouch. You look like a refugee." Jean was a shy child. She had large, dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. While Susan thrived in the spotlight, dancing for the guests and charming the adults, Jean hid. She hid behind curtains. She hid in the library. She hid inside her own head. But hiding at Misty Mountain was impossible because the world came to them. Dinner at the Stein house was not a family meal. It was a summit of the gods. Jean would be brought down in her velvet dress to curtsy to the guests. And who were the guests? There was Bette Davis, chain-smoking and barking laughter. There was Cary Grant, impossibly tan and elegant. There was Frank Sinatra, buzzing with dangerous energy. There were studio heads like Jack Warner and Daryl Zanuck, men who chewed cigars and decided the fate of nations with a phone call. To a normal child, this would have been a fantasy. To Jean Stein, it was a grotesque parade. She saw things the cameras missed. She saw the desperation in the eyes of the actresses who were aging out of their contracts. She saw the fear in the directors who were one flop away from ruin. She saw the way these powerful men fawned over her father, the doctor, because they knew he held the keys to their cages. She realized very early on that Hollywood was a company town, and her father was the company. Daddy owns them, she might have thought, watching a famous actor laugh too hard at her father's unfunny joke. They are just employees. This realization planted a seed of cynicism in Jean's heart that would never truly wither. It made her suspicious of surface beauty. It made her distrustful of charm. If the most famous people in the world were just frightened puppets dancing for her father, then what was fame worth? Nothing. But there was another lesson being taught at Misty Mountain, a darker one. It was the lesson of silence. The Steins were Jewish, but in the anti-Semitic climate of the American elite, they wore their heritage lightly, almost invisibly. Jules Stein wanted to assimilate. He wanted to be part of the WASP establishment. So at Misty Mountain, history was erased. There was no talk of the old country. There was no talk of the war in a personal sense. Everything was sanitized. Jean felt the weight of these secrets. She felt the gap between the truth of who they were and the image they projected. She became a watcher. She learned that if you stayed very quiet, people forgot you were there. And when people forget you are there, they reveal themselves. She would sit in the corner of the drawing room, pretending to read a book while listening to the adults trade gossip. She heard about the affairs. She heard about the abortions. She heard about the gambling debts and the blackmail. She was collecting data. She was building an archive of human frailty in her mind. The keeper of secrets was born in that drawing room. But as she entered her teenage years, the pressure to conform began to suffocate her. Her mother, Doris, had a plan for Jean. It was the same plan she had for Susan, a debutante ball, a suitable marriage to a man with a trust fund, and a life of charitable committees and lunch parties. "You have such potential, Jean," Doris would say, aggressive in her ambition. "If you would just fix your hair, if you would just smile more." But Jean didn't want to smile. She wanted to know why. She was sent to the best schools, of course. First in Los Angeles, then the inevitable boarding schools in the East and Switzerland. These institutions were designed to finish the product, to polish the rough edges of the American heiress until she shone like a diamond. But Jean was a jagged stone. At boarding school, she felt like an alien. The other girls talked about boys and clothes. Jean wanted to talk about books. She had discovered literature, and it was like finding oxygen in a vacuum. In books, people told the truth. In books, suffering was acknowledged, not hidden under foundation. She read Dostoevsky. She read Hemingway. She read the modernists who were tearing apart the polite structures of the 19th century. She began to look at her father, the great Jules Stein, not with fear, but with a critical, almost anthropological eye. She saw his brilliance, yes, but she also saw his emptiness. He had conquered the world, but he had no inner life. He had money, but no poetry. She determined, with the fierce, quiet stubbornness of the second child, that she would not be him, and she would not be her mother. "I am not one of you," she whispered to her reflection in the gilded mirrors of Misty Mountain. The breaking point came in the early 1950s. The era of the debutante was at its peak. Jean was expected to come out to society, to stand in a white dress and be inspected by the tribe. She hated it. She felt like a prize heifer at a county fair, only with better jewelry. The hypocrisy of it stung her. Here were people who controlled the culture of the world, acting out a 19th century fantasy of aristocracy. She needed an escape route. But she couldn't just run away. She was a Stein. She needed a destination that was acceptable to her parents, but liberated for her. She chose Paris. It was the classic move of the American searcher, but for Jean, it wasn't about romance or fashion. It was about hunting for a new father figure. She was looking for the anti-Jules. She was looking for a man who dealt in truth, not illusions. She convinced her parents to let her study at the Sorbonne. It was respectable. It was cultured. Doris approved because it sounded fancy. Jules approved because he thought it would get the intellectual nonsense out of her system before she settled down. They had no idea what they were unleashing. When Jean Stein boarded the ocean liner that would take her to Europe, she stood at the railing, watching the American coast fade into the mist. She was leaving behind the octopus. She was leaving behind the perfect, suffocating gardens of Misty Mountain. And she was hungry. She was hungry for the real world, the world of blood and ink, the world where people bled when they were cut. She didn't know it yet, but she was sailing toward a collision that would define the rest of her life. She was sailing toward a broken old man with a mustache and a southern drawl, a man who would see the watcher in her and hand her the keys to the kingdom of art. The curtain was coming down on the prologue. The Hollywood princess was dead. The muse was about to be born. Paris in the early 1950s was a city trying to dream again. The scars of the occupation were still visible on the buildings, and the rationing tickets had only just disappeared. But in the cafes of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, a new energy was vibrating. It was the energy of jazz, of existentialism, and of young Americans arriving in droves, armed with the GI Bill, or, in Jean Stein's case, a letter of credit from a father who owned half of California. Jean arrived in this city not as a tourist, but as a refugee seeking asylum from the suffocating perfection of her life. She was 19 years old. In Hollywood, she was Jules Stein's daughter, a label that stuck to her like a price tag. In Paris, she was just Jean, a girl with a sharp bob, an expensive coat, and a hunger that frightened her with its intensity. She didn't waste time looking at the Eiffel Tower. She went hunting. Her prey was not the playboys or the princes that her mother, Doris, had circled in the social register. Jean was hunting for giants. She wanted to find the people who created the culture her father merely sold. She wanted to touch the source. It was in the snowblind glamour of St. Moritz, during a winter excursion from her studies, that she found him, William Faulkner. He was battling the twin demons that haunt so many geniuses, alcohol and the crushing weight of his own reputation. When Jean met him, the contrast was almost comical. She was the heiress to the octopus, the daughter of the new corporate America. He was the voice of the old decaying agrarian past. She was money, he was debt. She was the future, he was trapped in history. But the chemistry was instantaneous and absolute. Jean didn't treat him like a monument. She treated him like a man who needed someone to listen. And Faulkner, isolated by his fame and his demons, saw in this quiet, intense girl a lifeline. He called her Jeannot. He allowed her into the fortress of his silence. Their relationship became the whisper of the literary world. Was it a romance? A mentorship? A scandal? It was all of those things, but mostly it was a transaction of souls. Jean gave Faulkner the adoration and the youthful energy he had lost. Faulkner gave Jean the one thing her father never could: validation. "You have a good mind, Jean," he would tell her, his voice thick with bourbon and tobacco. "Use it." For the first time in her life, she wasn't being judged on her posture or her marriageability. She was being judged on her intellect. The culmination of this relationship wasn't a wedding ring, but an interview. Jean, working now for a scrappy new literary journal called the Paris Review, convinced the notoriously press-shy Faulkner to sit for a formal interrogation. It took place in New York, in the chaos of a midtown apartment. Jean sat across from him with a tape recorder. This was her weapon. This was the moment the watcher became the chronicler. She asked him about his craft. She asked him about the burden of the South. She pushed him gently but firmly past the stock answers he gave to journalists. The resulting interview is considered one of the greatest ever published in the Paris Review. It captured the man in full, his arrogance, his humility, his terrifying dedication to his art. An artist is a creature driven by demons, Faulkner told her. He doesn't know why they chose him, and he's usually too busy to wonder. Jean recorded that sentence, and it vibrated in her bones. She realized she wasn't the artist. She wasn't the one driven by demons. She was the one holding the microphone. She was the witness. And she realized with a sudden clarity that this was a power all its own. The artist creates the work, but the witness creates the history. Armed with this new identity, Jean returned to America, but she didn't return to Los Angeles. Misty Mountain was the past. New York City was the future. The New York of the mid-1950s was a different beast than Hollywood. It was gritty, vertical, and obsessed with ideas. Jean moved into an apartment on the Upper West Side and went to work at the Paris Review office, which was actually just a room in George Plimpton's apartment. Plimpton was the golden boy of the literary scene, tall Brahmin, effortlessly charming. He became Jean's guide to this new world. But unlike the starlets in Hollywood who fought for the spotlight, Jean positioned herself in the shadows. She was the quiet engine in the background. She organized the parties. She smoothed the ruffled feathers of egos. She connected people. She was learning the art of the salon. She realized that if you put a Black Panther in a room with a conductor or a poet with a politician, sparks would fly. And Jean loved the sparks. She loved the dangerous electricity of colliding worlds, but the pressure from the West Coast was relentless. Her mother, Doris, was still demanding a proper life for her daughter. A job at a literary magazine was a cute hobby, Doris implied, but where was the husband? Where was the dynasty? In 1958, Jean gave them what they wanted, but on her terms. She married William Vanden Heuvel. On paper, Bill Vanden Heuvel was the dream son-in-law. He was handsome, a brilliant lawyer, a former diplomat, and a man with a soaring political future. He was the East Coast Kennedy type that Jules Stein respected because he understood power, and Doris Stein respected because he looked good in a tuxedo. But for Jean, the marriage was a passport. It was her entry visa into the most exclusive club in America, the inner circle of the Kennedy family. The Kennedys were the American royal family that the Steins pretended to be. They had the money, yes, but they also had the myth. They had the vigor, the Catholicism, the tragic glamour. And through her husband, Jean was swept into their orbit. This was the era of Camelot, but Jean wasn't interested in the king. She was drawn to the younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby. If Jack Kennedy was the sun, bright, distant, blinding, Bobby was the raw nerve. He was intense, moody, fiercely moralistic, and often ruthless. He felt things deeply. He had the same quality that Jean had seen in Faulkner, a sense of tragic destiny. Jean and Bobby formed a bond that went beyond politics. It was an intellectual intimacy. They would talk for hours about Aeschylus, about the Greeks, about the nature of suffering. Jean saw that beneath the ruthless political operator, there was a man in constant pain, a man trying to heal the world because he couldn't heal himself. She became a fixture in the Kennedy campaign. But again, she wasn't the one handing out bumper stickers. She was the observer. She traveled with them. She watched the way the crowds looked at them with a hunger that was almost religious. She saw the danger in it. Having grown up watching movie stars being devoured by their fans, Jean recognized the look in the eyes of the American public. They wanted to consume the Kennedys. They wanted to eat them alive. They love him too much, she might have whispered to herself, watching Bobby wade into a sea of screaming hands in a poverty-stricken town in the Delta. This kind of love always ends in blood. But she couldn't look away. She was addicted to the proximity of history. Her life in the early 1960s was a blur of high-stakes glamour. She was juggling two worlds. In the morning, she might be editing a manuscript for a struggling poet in the village. In the evening, she was in a ball gown at the White House, watching the president charm the diplomatic corps. She was the bridge. She brought the writers to the politicians. She brought the radical ideas of the streets into the drawing rooms of Park Avenue. She was the keeper of secrets for an entire generation of the elite. And she was a mother now. She had two daughters, Katrina and Wendy. She tried to give them the warmth she had never received at Misty Mountain, but she was also a woman consumed by her work and her social obligations. She was running faster and faster, trying to outpace the ghost of her own boredom. Then came Dallas, November 1963. The assassination of John F. Kennedy shattered the world, but for Jean, it was a confirmation of her darkest theories. The octopus of violence that she had sensed beneath the surface of American life had finally broken through. She watched Bobby disintegrate. The man of steel became a ghost. He walked through the days in a trance of grief, wearing his brother's old flight jacket, eyes hollowed out. Jean didn't abandon him. She moved closer. She became one of the few people who could sit with him in the silence. She understood that there are no words for that kind of loss. You just have to endure it. As the years moved toward the chaotic crescendo of the late 60s, Jean sensed that the story wasn't over. Bobby was going to run. He had to run. It was the only way to purge the ghosts. And she knew, with a terrifying, prophetic certainty, that she had to be there to witness it. By 1968, the country was on fire. Vietnam, civil rights, the riots, the fabric of the nation was tearing apart. And into this maelstrom stepped Bobby Kennedy, seeking the presidency, not as a career move, but as a crusade. Jean joined the campaign. She left her comfortable apartment, her perfectly curated life, and got on the plane. She was there in the chaotic rallies. She was there in the strategy meetings. She was recording it all in her mind. She saw the hope in the faces of the poor, the coal miners in Appalachia, the farm workers in California. They looked at Bobby as a savior. The air in 1968 was thick with paranoia. Every time a balloon popped at a rally, the Secret Service flinched. Jean felt the tension in her skin. It was the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. They arrived in Los Angeles in June. It was a homecoming for Jean, but a twisted one. They were at the Ambassador Hotel, a place her father, Jules Stein, knew well, a place of old Hollywood glamour. On the night of the California primary, victory was in the air. The ballroom was a crush of bodies, balloons, and screams of joy. "On to Chicago," they chanted. Jean was there. She was near the stage. She saw Bobby deliver his victory speech. He looked tired, but he looked happy. The shadow seemed to have lifted just for a moment. "So now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there," he said, flashing that famous shy smile. He stepped off the podium and walked into the kitchen pantry. Jean didn't see the gun, but she heard the pops, small flat sounds like firecrackers, not magnificent, just mechanical. Then the screams began. The chaos that followed was a blur of red and black. The octopus had returned. The violence that had been stalking them for years had finally closed its jaws. Jean was in the whirlwind, the hospital, the waiting room, the prayers that bounced off the ceiling, and finally, the announcement. He was gone. The flight back to New York was a funeral procession in the sky, but the true journey was the train ride that followed. The funeral train carrying Bobby's body from New York to Washington. Jean was on that train. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the American heartland, and as she looked out the window, she saw something that broke her heart and then reconstructed it. Along the tracks for hundreds of miles stood the people, men in overalls, holding hats over their hearts, women in curlers crying, Boy Scouts saluting, black families, white families, standing together in the heat, united by grief. They weren't looking at Jean, they were looking at the box that held their hope. And in that moment, sitting in the velvet seat of a private train car, Jean Stein had an epiphany that would change the rest of her life. She realized that the official history books would talk about the assassin and the politics and the laws, but they would miss this. They would miss the texture of the grief. They would miss the voice of the woman in the faded dress standing by the tracks in Baltimore. She realized that the truth wasn't in the penthouse. It was on the pavement. It wasn't in the speech. It was in the silence between the words. She looked at the notebook in her lap. She picked up her pen. She stopped being the Stein girl. She stopped being the Kennedy friend. She became the author. The prologue was over. The romance was dead. The tragedy had happened. Now, the work of excavation had to begin. Jean Stein was about to invent a new way of telling the truth, but she had to walk through the graveyard of her own dreams to do it. The train rattled on toward Arlington, carrying the dead prince and the living witness. Jean Stein sat by the window, her reflection ghosting over the passing landscape of a fractured America. She didn't know it then, as the wheels clicked a rhythmic dirge on the tracks. But the death of Robert Kennedy was the end of her emotional youth. The capacity for pure, unadulterated hope had been excised from her soul with the precision of her father's surgical tools. She would never again trust a savior. She would never again believe that a single man could fix the world. From this moment on, she would trust only the chorus, the messy, contradictory, overlapping voices of the crowd. She had come to the East Coast to find a new father, and she had found two. Faulkner, who taught her to see the demons, and Bobby, who taught her that the demons usually win. Both were gone now. Jean Stein was alone in the club car of history. The train was slowing down as it approached Washington. She dried her eyes. There would be no more weeping. There was only the story. And the story, she realized with a cold shiver, was just beginning. The tape recorder in her mind clicked on. It would not turn off again for 40 years. The year 1968 didn't just end. It collapsed. For Jean Stein, the funeral train of Robert F. Kennedy wasn't merely a vehicle moving from New York to Washington. It was a transport leaving the land of the living for the land of the ghosts. When she stepped off that train, the golden era of American optimism was officially over. The Kennedys were gone. Martin Luther King was gone. The cities were burning. And Jean, now in her mid-30s, found herself standing in the wreckage of her own idealism. The daughter of the octopus had tried to escape into the arms of the saviors, only to watch the saviors bleed out on hotel floors. She retreated to New York. But it wasn't a retreat into silence. It was a retreat into a new kind of noise. Jean had learned a terrifying lesson on that funeral train. She had seen that history is not a straight line drawn by great men. It is a chaotic mosaic of millions of tiny fractured moments. She realized that the only way to tell the truth about a shattered world was to use a shattered form. She began to work on her first book, American Journey: The Times of Robert Kennedy. Most biographers would have written a sweeping narrative. Bobby was born, Bobby lived, Bobby died. Jean did the opposite. She interviewed the people on the train. She interviewed the passengers, the aides, the conductors, the people standing on the tracks. She wove their voices together without a narrator. It was an experiment in oral history, a genre that was usually reserved for folklore or sociology. But Jean applied it to high tragedy. She removed her own voice entirely. She became the invisible editor, the god who arranges the chaos but never speaks. American Journey was a critical success, but it was just the warm-up. Jean was looking for a subject that could hold the weight of her own growing darkness. She needed a story that mirrored the rot she felt beneath the surface of the American elite. She found it in a girl named Edie. Edie Sedgwick was the it girl of 1965. She was the waif with the silver hair, the raccoon eye makeup, and the dangling earrings who danced on tables at Max's Kansas City. She was Andy Warhol's superstar, the face of the pop art explosion. But by the early 1970s, Edie was dead. She had died at 28, her body consumed by barbiturates and mental illness. To the world, she was a cautionary tale, a piece of 60s trash culture that had been discarded. But Jean Stein saw something else. She looked at Edie's last name, Sedgwick. The Sedgwicks were American royalty. They were one of the founding families of New England. They had signed the Declaration of Independence. They were judges, writers, generals. They were the old money that Jean's mother, Doris Stein, had spent her life trying to emulate. And yet this golden lineage had produced Edie, a beautiful broken girl who shot speed into her veins and died in a Santa Barbara boarding house. Jean realized that Edie wasn't just a pop culture footnote. She was the symptom of a disease. She was the proof that the American aristocracy was rotting from the inside out. Jean began the project that would consume her for a decade. She teamed up with George Plimpton, her old friend from the Paris Review, to edit the book. But the vision was pure Stein. She became a detective of the soul. She tracked down everyone. She went to the mental hospitals. She went to the biker bars. She went to the drawing rooms of Park Avenue. She sat with Edie's family, the terrifying patriarch Alice Sedgwick and her husband Duke, and she turned on her tape recorder. This was Jean's superpower. She was small, soft-spoken, and impeccably dressed. People looked at her and saw a harmless socialite. They saw Jules Stein's daughter. So they lowered their guard. They forgot the tape was rolling, and then they confessed. They told her about the incest. They told her about the madness. They told her about the cruelty of a father who kept his children in a golden cage of abuse. They told her about the drugs that fueled the art world. Jean absorbed it all. It was a grueling process. She was swimming in a river of other people's pain. She would come home to her apartment at 10 Gracie Square, surrounded by her Picassos and her servants, and play the tapes. The voices filled the room. The voice of Andy Warhol, vacant and detached. The voice of Edie, manic and terrified. The voice of the doctors, cold and clinical. Jean spliced them together like a film editor. She placed contradictory lies next to each other and let them fight. She didn't tell the reader what to think. She forced the reader to stand in the room and listen to the screaming match. When Edie, American Girl was published in 1982, it hit the literary world like a meteor. It was a sensation. It spent weeks on the bestseller list. It was hailed as the definitive portrait of the 1960s. Truman Capote, the master of the nonfiction novel, read it and reportedly felt a twinge of jealousy. Jean Stein had done what he had tried to do in Answered Prayers. She had peeled the skin off the upper class and shown the blood underneath. But the success of Edie came with a price. Jean had betrayed her class. She had violated the omerta of the wealthy. The rule was simple. You can be crazy, you can be drunk, you can be cruel, but you never talk to the press. Jean had not only talked, she had handed the microphone to the victims. The book changed her social standing. She was no longer just the rich hostess. She was a force. Her apartment became the intellectual epicenter of New York. If you were a Nobel Prize winner, a dissident poet, or a Hollywood legend passing through Manhattan, you went to Jean's. Her parties were legendary, but they weren't fun in the traditional sense. They were intense. Jean would move through the rooms like a ghost in couture. She would introduce Salman Rushdie to a graffiti artist. She would place a Palestinian scholar next to a Zionist billionaire. She wanted friction. She wanted to see what happened when worlds collided. But amidst the noise of the salon, Jean was becoming quieter. Her personal life was a series of slow erosions. Her marriage to Bill Vanden Heuvel had ended. A second marriage to Torsten Wiesel, a Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist, also dissolved. It seemed that Jean could connect everyone else, but she couldn't connect herself to a permanent partner. She was the great connector, but she was unplugged. She doted on her two daughters, Katrina and Wendy. She was a fierce, protective mother, trying to shield them from the Stein curse, the coldness, the pressure to be perfect. But she was also a woman who spent her nights listening to tapes of dead people. By the 1990s, the world was changing again. The gritty, intellectual New York of the 70s and 80s was vanishing. Money was taking over. The hedge fund managers were buying the townhouses. The artists were being pushed out to Brooklyn. Jean looked around and saw the octopus returning. This time it wasn't MCA, it was Wall Street. It was global capital. It was a world where value was determined by price, not meaning. She felt a deep ancestral pull to return to the source of the infection. She needed to go back to the beginning. She needed to go back to Hollywood. For 20 years, Jean Stein worked on her final masterpiece. The title was West of Eden. If Edie was an autopsy of the East Coast aristocracy, West of Eden was a demolition of her own home. She turned her gaze back to Los Angeles, back to the Dream Factory, back to Misty Mountain. She wanted to understand the place that had made her. She wanted to understand the men like her father, Jules Stein, Jack Warner, David O. Selznick, the Jewish moguls who had invented the American dream while being excluded from it. She began the interviews again, but this time the ghosts were personal. She interviewed the survivors of the great Hollywood dynasties. She talked to the children who had grown up in the shadow of the studios. She dug up the stories that had been buried by the publicity departments for 50 years. She found a landscape of devastation. She found the daughter of a studio head who had been lobotomized. She found the suicides. She found the madness. She traced the history of the Doheny family, the oil barons of Los Angeles, and their slide into murder and paranoia. And she wrote about the Steins. Writing about her own family was the hardest act of her life. She had to look at her father, not as the daddy she loved, but as the ruthless capitalist he was. She had to look at her mother Doris and see the cold ambition that had frozen the family's heart. She was dissecting her own DNA. The process was agonizing. It took decades. Jean was a perfectionist. She would edit a single paragraph for weeks. She was terrified of getting it wrong. She felt the weight of the dead on her shoulders. "I'm the last one," she told a friend. "If I don't tell it, it disappears." She was the archivist of the abyss. As the new millennium dawned, Jean Stein was an older woman, still beautiful, still elegant, but increasingly fragile. The darkness she had spent her life documenting was beginning to leak into her own soul. The publication of West of Eden in 2016 was a triumph. The reviews were ecstatic. It was called a masterpiece of oral history, a dark, dazzling portrait of Los Angeles. But for Jean, The publication wasn't a celebration. It was a conclusion. She had finished the work. She had told the stories. She had betrayed all the secrets. And now the silence returned. But this time, the silence wasn't a quiet room in a library. It was a roar. It was the sound of emptiness. She sat in her apartment at 10 Gracie Square, surrounded by the artifacts of a life lived at the summit. The books, the paintings, the photographs of her with Bobby, with Faulkner, with the world. She was trapped in a museum of her own making. She began to feel the walls closing in. The depression, which had always been a low hum in the background of her life, turned up the volume. It became a scream. She tried to seek help. She saw doctors. She tried treatments. But how do you cure a soul that has seen the machinery of the world and found it broken? She had spent much of her life examining the lives of the wealthy and the powerful. The watcher was tired of watching. The listener was tired of listening. She looked out at the city she had conquered. She saw the lights of the bridges. She saw the dark flow of the river. She realized that there was only one secret left to keep, the secret of the final exit. The tape was running out. The spool was spinning loose. It was time to make the final edit. In the quiet of her library, Jean Stein placed the final manuscript of West of Eden on the shelf. It sat next to Edie, An American Journey. 3 books, 3 tombstones, one for the politician, one for the muse, and one for the father. She ran her hand over the spine of the book. It was done. The trilogy of American disillusionment was complete. She had mapped the geography of the void, from the funeral train to the factory to the dream factory. She sat in her chair and looked at the phone. It didn't ring. Or perhaps it did, and she just didn't answer. The voices of the living seemed distant now, tinny and trivial compared to the symphonic chorus of the dead that played in her head. She walked to the window. The glass was cold against her forehead. Below, the city moved on, indifferent, hungry, alive. Jean Stein took a breath. The air in the penthouse was rarefied, filtered, perfect. It tasted of nothing. She turned off the lights. The publication of a masterpiece is supposed to be a birth, a moment of release and celebration. But for Jean Stein, the release of West of Eden in 2016 felt more like an autopsy. She had spent 20 years in the trenches of memory, digging up the bones of the Hollywood dynasties, mapping the subterranean tunnels of greed and madness that ran beneath the manicured lawns of Beverly Hills. She had summoned the ghosts of her father, Jules Stein, and her mother, Doris. She had forced them to speak, to confess their coldness and their ambition. She had successfully dismantled the myth of her own childhood. But when the book was finished, when the reviews came in hailing it as a dark classic and an essential oral history, Jean didn't feel lighter. She felt hollowed out. It is a dangerous thing for an artist to finish their life's work while they are still alive. The project that had anchored her to the world, the daily discipline of interviews, transcripts, and editing, was gone. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. Jean was 82 years old. She was frail. The physical act of moving through the world had become a negotiation with gravity. But her mind was as sharp and terrifying as a diamond cutter. And that mind, now unoccupied by the voices of others, turned its formidable power inward. The New York of 2016 was a city Jean recognized, but no longer felt part of. The rough, intellectual edges of the city she had loved in the 1950s, the city of abstract expressionists and chain-smoking poets, had been smoothed over by money. The conversations at dinner parties had shifted from literature to real estate, from art to assets. Her apartment at 10 Gracie Square was a fortress. It was beautiful, undeniably. It was filled with the trophies of a life spent at the cultural vanguard. There was the Warhol silk screen. There was the sculpture by Giacometti. There were the books, thousands of them, standing like silent soldiers on the shelves. But beauty, when unaccompanied by love, can be a form of oppression. The Stein curse, which she had spent a lifetime running from, began to catch up. She looked in the mirror and saw the ghost of her mother, Doris. She saw the same perfectionism, the same inability to simply be. She had spent her life trying not to be the ice queen her mother was, but in her isolation, the ice was forming around her. She had friends, of course. Jean Stein always had friends. But her friendships were complex. She was the listener, the confessor, the patron. People came to her to be heard. They came to her to be connected. But who listened to the listener? "I feel like I am disappearing," she told a confidant during this period. "I am standing in the middle of the room and no one sees me. They see the name, they see the history, but they don't see Jean." The depression that descended upon her was not a sudden storm. It was a rising tide. It was a chemical and existential flood. It was the black dog that had stalked so many of the people she wrote about. Edie Sedgwick, William Faulkner, Truman Capote. Jean had chronicled their destruction with empathy, but now she was living it. She sought help. Jean was a believer in the intellect, and she believed the mind could be fixed like a machine. She saw psychiatrists. She took medication. She tried to work on her depression the way she worked on a manuscript. She edited her thoughts. She tried to cut out the despair, but the despair wasn't a typo. It was the text. She began to feel a profound sense of uselessness. In a culture that worships youth and productivity, an 80-year-old woman, no matter how wealthy or accomplished, is often treated as an artifact, a piece of fine china to be kept in a cabinet, dusted off for special occasions, and then put back. Jean hated being fragile. She hated the pity in people's eyes when they helped her into a car. She was the daughter of the octopus. She was the woman who had walked through the riots of 1968. She was a warrior of the intellect. To be reduced to a sweet old lady was a humiliation she could not bear. And then there was the physical pain, the indignities of age, the failing eyesight, a cruel irony for a woman whose father had been an eye doctor and whose life had been defined by visual culture. The world was blurring at the edges. As 2016 bled into 2017, the political climate of America darkened. The election of Donald Trump sent a shockwave through Jean's circle. It felt like the final triumph of everything she had spent her life critiquing. It was the victory of the image over the word. It was the triumph of the brash, gold-plated, hollow ambition that she had dissected in West of Eden. The world, it seemed, had not learned the lessons she had tried to teach. The octopus had won. Jean felt like a stranger in her own country. The values she cherished, nuance, privacy, intellectual rigor, were being trampled by a culture of noise and narcissism. She began to withdraw. The famous salon at Gracie Square went quiet. The invitations stopped flowing. She spent her days in the apartment looking out at the East River. The river became a companion. It was constant. It was powerful. It was indifferent. It flowed past the city, carrying the debris of millions of lives out to the ocean. Jean watched the currents. She watched the barges. She watched the light change on the water. She began to think about the end. Suicide is rarely a spontaneous act for the elderly. It is a calculation. It is a balance sheet. Jean Stein, the daughter of a businessman, looked at the ledger of her life. On one side, the pain, the loneliness, the fading faculties, the prospect of a slow, humiliating decline in a hospital bed, surrounded by nurses who didn't know who William Faulkner was. On the other side, the exit, control, dignity, a final definitive edit. She didn't want to fade away. She didn't want to be a lingering footnote. She wanted to place a period at the end of the sentence herself. There is a terrifying logic to her thought process. Jean had spent her life controlling the narrative. She controlled the interviews. She controlled the transcripts. She decided what went in and what was left out. Why should her death be any different? Why should she let biology dictate the final chapter? I want to dictate the ending, she might have thought, standing on the terrace in the biting wind of a New York winter. I want to close the book. She began to organize her affairs. It was done quietly, subtly. There were no dramatic goodbyes. That would have been vulgar. That would have been too Hollywood. Jean was New York. She was understated. She organized her archives. She ensured her daughters, Katrina and Wendy, were protected. She looked at her art collection, the physical manifestations of her taste and her wealth, and realized they were just things: canvas and paint, metal and stone. They would survive her. They would be sold at Sotheby's. They would hang on other walls. She was detaching. There is a phenomenon known to psychiatrists where a suicidal patient suddenly seems calmer, happier in the days before the act. It is the peace of resolution. The decision has been made. The struggle is over. In April 2017, Jean seemed to have found that peace. She was still elegant. She was still sharp. But there was a distance in her eyes. She was looking through people, not at them. She was looking at the door. On the weekend of April 29th, the city was draped in a damp, heavy spring fog. It was the kind of weather that muffles sound, that makes the skyscrapers look like tombstones. Jean was in the apartment. She was surrounded by the silence she had curated, the silence of the library, the silence of the museum. She thought about Edie Sedgwick. Edie had burned out in a blaze of chemicals. She thought about Bobby Kennedy. Bobby had been taken by a bullet. She thought about her father, Jules. Jules had died an old man, rich and feared. But had he ever been truly known? Jean realized that she was the last one left who knew the whole story. She was the keeper of the secrets, and the burden of the secrets was too heavy. She didn't want to remember anymore. She didn't want to remember the sound of the gunshots in the Ambassador Hotel. She didn't want to remember the look in Edie's eyes when the drugs took hold. She didn't want to remember the coldness of her mother's touch. She wanted oblivion. The concept of the void is terrifying to most, but to Jean it looked like a sanctuary. It looked like the only place where the voices would finally stop. She went to sleep on the night of April 29th. Or perhaps she didn't sleep. Perhaps she lay awake, listening to the hum of the city, the great indifferent machine that she had spent 80 years trying to understand. When the sun rose on April 30th, it was a Sunday, the day of rest. Jean rose. She dressed. She didn't put on a robe. She didn't dress for bed. She dressed for the day. She was Jean Stein, after all. Appearance mattered. She walked through the apartment. She passed the desk where she had written West of Eden. She passed the photos of her children. She passed the window that looked out onto the park. She walked to the terrace door. The handle turned easily. It was well oiled. Everything in Jean Stein's life worked perfectly. She stepped out into the cool air. The wind whipped at her clothes. She was standing on the precipice of the world. She wasn't afraid. She had faced down the most powerful men in America. She had faced down the demons of history. She had faced down her own family. The railing was metal, cold, and hard. She didn't look back at the apartment. There was nothing left in there for her. The stories were all written. The tapes were all transcribed. She looked forward. Into the gray, into the air, she climbed. The moment before the fall is a moment of absolute suspension. Between the railing and the air, there is a fraction of a second where the human being is neither alive nor dead, but purely kinetic potential. In that heartbeat, Jean Stein ceased to be the biographer, the heiress, the mother, the socialite. She became, finally, weightless. For 83 years, she had carried the weight of the Stein name, the weight of the Kennedy tragedy, the weight of the Sedgwick ruin. She had carried the heavy, gold-plated armor of her class. Now, she shed it all. As she prepared to step into the void, she was doing the only thing she had never done in her life. She was losing control, or perhaps she was taking it back in the most absolute way possible. The city held its breath. The octopus of her father's legacy could not reach her here. The expectations of her mother could not judge her here. She was alone, and for the first time that aloneness was not a prison. It was a wing. Gravity is the only law that money cannot bribe. It is the one force that treats a billionaire heiress exactly the same way it treats a falling leaf. Jean Stein died by suicide in April 2017 at her apartment on 10 Gracie Square. It was a terrifying, rushing blurring of the limestone facade, the windows of her neighbors, and the pale spring sky. When she struck the ground of the inner courtyard, the violence of the impact shattered more than just a body. It shattered the illusion of the untouchable life. In the Upper East Side, death is supposed to be a hushed affair, a quiet cessation of breath in a room with high thread count sheets, followed by a polite memorial service at St. James. It is not supposed to be a bloody, broken reality on the pavement. The doormen, those stoic guardians of the tower, were the first to respond, then the sirens. The flashing lights of the NYPD cut through the gray morning, reflecting off the windows of the building where Gloria Vanderbilt once lived, where the elite of New York hid from the world. The news spread through the city not like a rumor, but like a shockwave. Phones began to ring in the Hamptons, in Hollywood, in London. It seemed impossible. Jean Stein was the woman who hosted the parties. Jean Stein was the woman who connected people. Jean Stein was the one who listened to the tragedies. She wasn't supposed to be the tragedy. But as the initial horror subsided, a colder, deeper realization set in among those who knew her best. This was not a random act of madness. It was a concluding statement. It was the final chapter of West of Eden, written in the language of the body. The obituaries that followed were filled with the usual lists of accomplishments. The New York Times called her an author and hostess. They listed her famous friends. They mentioned her father, Jules Stein. They mentioned her books. But reading the tributes felt like reading the menu at a banquet where the food had turned to ash. They missed the point. They treated her death as a sad end to a glamorous life. They didn't understand that for Jean, the glamour was the sadness. Jean's funeral was not the circus she had spent her life avoiding. It was a somber gathering of the survivors of the 20th century. The writers, the artists, the aging lions of the New York intelligentsia gathered to say goodbye to the woman who had been their mirror. Without Jean, who would reflect them? Without Jean, who would remember the specific frequency of the era they had built? Her death marked the definitive end of old New York. The city of literary salons, where ideas were currency and social standing, was based on wit rather than net worth, had been dying for years. Jean Stein was its last great keeper. When she jumped, she took the keys to the kingdom with her. But what did she leave behind? When the estate was settled, the art was sold. The Picasso, the Warhol, the Giacometti, they were auctioned off, dispersed into the collections of new billionaires who perhaps didn't know the stories behind them. The apartment at 10 Gracie Square was emptied. The physical traces of Jean Stein were scrubbed away to make room for the next tenant. However, Jean had built a monument that could not be auctioned. Her books, American Journey, Edie, and West of Eden, remain on the shelves, and as time passes, their power only grows. They are not just biographies. They are black box recorders of the American century. By using the oral history format, by refusing to insert her own voice, Jean Stein created the most democratic history of the elite ever written. She allowed the maid to speak with the same volume as the mogul. She allowed the drug addict to contradict the doctor. She taught us that the truth is not a monologue, it is a cacophony. In Edie, she showed us that the 1960s wasn't just a party, it was a breakdown. In West of Eden, she showed us that Hollywood wasn't a dream factory, it was a colony of exploitation. She was the canary in the coal mine who sang for 50 years. She sang about the toxic gas of wealth. She sang about the emotional vacuum of fame. She warned us over and over again that if you worship the image, you will lose your soul. We listened to the music, but we didn't hear the warning. In the end, Jean Stein's life was a paradox of access and isolation. She was the woman who could get anyone on the phone, but who felt she had no one to call. She was the woman who knew everyone's secrets, but died feeling unknown. There is a haunting symmetry to her story. She began her life at Misty Mountain, looking down on Los Angeles from a fortress of privilege. She ended her life at Gracie Square, looking down on New York from a fortress of privilege. She spent 83 years trying to climb down from the mountain. She tried to descend using art, literature, and empathy, but the mountain was too high, the walls were too smooth. The Stein curse, the golden cage built by her father, was too strong. So she didn't climb down. She jumped. It was a rejection. It was a flight. It was a return to the earth that her family had tried so hard to rise above. If you stand on the corner of East End Avenue and 88th Street today, you can look up at the limestone tower of 10 Gracie Square. It stands silent, imposing, a monument to a vanishing world of white gloves and whispered conversations. The currents of the East River still flow past it, dark and heavy, indifferent to the history on the shore. Jean Stein is gone. The watcher has left the room. But if you listen closely to the silence she left behind, you can hear the echoes of the voices she captured. You can hear Faulkner's slow drawl. You can hear Bobby Kennedy's urgent hope. You can hear Edie Sedgwick's manic laughter. You can hear the hum of the octopus devouring the world. Jean Stein didn't just write about these ghosts, she joined them. She was the perfect witness. She stood in the corner of the American Party for 6 decades, holding the microphone, nodding, recording, remembering. She saw the beauty and she saw the rot. She saw the glittering surface and she saw the blood beneath the floorboards. And when the party was over, when the lights came on and revealed the debris on the floor, she did the only thing a true observer could do. She turned off the recorder, she put down the pen, and she exited the frame. Her life asks us a terrifying question, one that echoes from the pavement of the Upper East Side to the hills of Hollywood. What is the cost of seeing the truth? For Jean Stein, the cost was everything. She was the woman who knew too much. She was the girl who saw the wires that held up the puppets. And in the final accounting, she decided that she would rather fall into the darkness of truth than float in the light of the lie.